As a preface, this clocks in at just over 2,800 words. I'm verbose by nature, and I wanted to try and really get across my thoughts and experiences of being homeless, as well as my gratitude for the help I've been given. Plus, I admit, I'm just verbose by nature. Anyway, here it is. Becoming homeless. When I was asked to write this, I was only too happy to oblige. The Home for Good organization in general, and Carmen Sampson, Lily Ortiz, Mateo, and others have been very kind and helpful. I found it difficult to nail down in words, however, because I found homelessness itself very much an alien existence, with concepts and purviews very much outside what we're told is the norm. I hope it will help to start out with some background, some context, which leads into the actual aid offered by Home for Good, even though it will be peppered with observations and asides. I'm also simply not terribly comfortable in talking about myself much at all, which admittedly may make this even less succinct. It may at times be rambling, meandering, but it all relates to being homeless and not only the difficulties faced, but how Home for Good helps overcome them. With that said, the Town Center Hotel was the cheapest place in town, which is why my mother and I ended up there. It was the culmination of a lifetime of choices and struggles, starting far enough back to make it difficult to say there was even a singular, definitive starting point. Thanks to getting SendCal through the assistance of Home for Good, I've been able to seek therapy sessions at local community health centers, through which I've been diagnosed with generalized anxiety and depression, which were themselves either culminations of, or at least strengthened through, the aforementioned struggles and choices. It also seems useful to note here as another element of context to point to, at least vaguely, the sorts of struggles I meant. The home I grew up in was abusive and mentally destructive, as it was when my mother grew up there. I say all of that as background, as I do by saying that, by the point of arriving at the Town Center Hotel, I'd officially left home 3 times, and due to varying factors, I failed to make a go of it each time. Going to the Town Center was odd in a way. I knew the reputation it had earned. Drugs, both selling and taking, alcohol, people of questionable moral and ethical character, skewed toward the larcenous, the roughneck, the otherwise criminal. That isn't exactly what we found when we moved in, though. We found a group of people who were far from perfect, far even from most people's metrics for good. What we did find was a group of people doing their best. The drugs were almost entirely gone, and the last dregs being focused on for removal. Alcohol was becoming rarer. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were still difficulties with clashing personalities that what amounted to an apartment complex always brings. But it was, surprisingly, a home where people generally came together and worked together. That changed in the early hours of October 12th, 2013, when Amos Lee Andrews decided to take out his anger at being fired from his job on the people who lived in the building. That act of misdirected and ill-thought-out retribution was a direct cause to my current homelessness. The first year was a blur. Time, period, has become more intangible, but that first year especially so. When each day is nearly identical to the one before, in nearly every respect, it became difficult to truly judge the passage of time. Getting back on track, I realized in the first year that there were a lot of things no one tells you about being homeless. There are rules to learn and follow, never written down and rarely mentioned, yet rigidly adhered to nonetheless. I consider myself observant, autodidactic even, perhaps to the point of being erudite. I don't say that immodestly. I claim expertise in no topic, only certain levels of familiarity. I say all of that to say I am, again, observant, and it is through the observation that I learned these unspoken rules. That first year, including the ones about what happened when someone ignores or breaks the rules. I also noticed that nearly every interaction I had with people changed after becoming homeless, with no other discernible contributing factor but the homelessness itself. Before becoming homeless, my interactions with police officers, for example, was always cordial and polite, even friendly. After becoming homeless, however, I noticed more caution, more uncertainty. I certainly noticed fewer occasions of being taken on my word. that isn't to say I've had a bad interaction with a police officer. I say, in fact, that I have not. Even as I became more and more obviously homeless, my interactions with police have stayed relatively cordial. I merely speak to an additional undertone of hesitation and caution, and more work performed to ascertain my status as relative to whatever cause was given for the interaction to begin with, as well as to my general state. Interactions changed, as stated. Perceptions became more important. Most of us know that, to some degree, perceptions matter. We, as a culture, make a big deal of first impressions. We have dressy clothing and debates over what constitutes proper examples thereof. And we have debates over proper levels of personal grooming. Perception matters. It just matters much, much more when one is homeless. It doesn't just matter what I would or wouldn't do, what I might or mightn't be capable of. It even matters less than it perhaps should, what I can prove. What matters is what people think when they see me. I had to learn very quickly to adapt to that and make it work for me. I had to learn how to manage my bearing, my mien, to display a character of general quietness and innocence. This wasn't especially difficult until such times as I was asked about, occasionally outright accused of committing, crimes or acts against public decency. There is little that tests one's character and fortitude as being forced to look at an authority figure in the eye and see their disbelief reflected therein when one attempts to claim innocence. It becomes all the more difficult when there is nothing that stands between continued freedom or incarceration save solely whether one can overcome that disbelief. On a more external level, I had to learn how to make contacts and acquaintances amongst the homeless population, and not just to create those contacts, but also to maintain them at certain levels. I learned how pervasive drug use and thievery was within the homeless population, and I wanted to distance myself from it. But no one survives being homeless while being truly alone. One needs contacts and acquaintances to pass information along, to gather in productive numbers, to provide security for one another, and so on. As I'd said before, time swiftly becomes, if not meaningless, at least much more fluid when one is homeless. That's partly because we live by schedules, by routines. Some are of our own making, but some are not. We can't control when businesses open and close, the hours for which charities offer their services, and so on. As also stated, it then helps to make each day close to a precise copy of the one before. As such, it becomes difficult for me to give any hard and fast timeframes for anything. 1 week is, very often, nearly a copy of the one before and the one after, with occasional differences for seasons. Even then, the primary differences come in the year-end holidays of Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. Even so, they're the same every year, too, more or less. None of that is bad. I don't say all that for any reason but to make it clear that I hesitate to be more specific than a few years for this, a couple months for that, and so on. I had to look up the date of the fire for this missive, and that was a particularly traumatic event. Events that are commonplace to the point of being blasé simply blend together. My mother became ill approximately a year or two after we became homeless, which resulted in her needing to be hospitalized for a while. When she was discharged, she knew she had to go to the shelter, so we took her there, I believe the very day of her discharge. This was where, I believe, she first came into contact with Carmen Sampson, though I could well be mistaken. As an aside, it would be very reasonable to ask why I, myself, don't go to the shelter. Due in part to upbringing, I am not simply all right with solitude, but I very much require it. I am not psychologically capable of being surrounded by people all day, every day. Particularly at the end of the day, I very much require quiet and solitude, more than a matter of comfort, but as a matter of continued functionality and stability. Further, while the staff of the Good Samaritan shelter that I've met are kind, courteous, thoughtful, and mature, the clients thereof are rarely anything of that sort. The clients that I have personally met and interacted with tend to be childish, even emotionally stunted to the point of abject selfishness, and a seemingly literal inability to understand or process others' paradigms or views. I lack an ability to work with such for very long, and I lack the ability to obtain any level of comfort and calm in such an environment. As such, I sleep in the car, as I have since first becoming homeless. I believe I first met Lily Ortiz somewhere around taking my mother to the shelter as well, though at the time she was volunteering for the Salvation Army. I didn't actually meet Carmen until much later, but I remember being struck that Lily was genuinely desirous to help the homeless she interacted with. Most people in such organizations are, if to varying levels, hence their being members of their organizations to begin with. However, Lily seemed one of those who still had the energy to proactively help, as well as to, if I may be blunt, put up with the usual levels of lack of forethought, abrasiveness, rudeness, and simple crudity that the homeless population at times displays. I finally met Carmen in person in, I believe, early spring of 2018. Up until then, I had only heard about her through other clients of the Good Samaritan shelter, particularly my mother. Such accounts are, by their very nature, suspect, of course. We, all of us, want to put the very best version of ourselves forward. And if we're the ones telling our tale, it becomes all too easy to do just that. Further, if we cast ourselves as the hero, then we almost automatically cast anyone who, seemingly at least, works against us as the villain. I knew from first-hand experience that many of the shelter clients exemplified this idea, and such, their stories didn't stand against simple logical thought and scrutiny. As such, for all the stories warning me about Carmen, I found myself more and more actually looking forward to meeting her. I forget now exactly what our meeting was about. My mother and I needed to collectively fill out some paperwork or the like, I believe. What matters, I suppose, is my perception of Carmen. I found, well, the one thing that always comes to mind is the cliche of a force of nature. Cliche though it is, I still think it's rather apt. This was someone who I could look at and fully believe that I'd not get led into beating around the bush, that I would be told exactly what was needed and why. This became all the more relevant and important as she became my own caseworker. One element of preferring, even at times requiring, solitude is the ability to motivate myself. I don't think it's immodest to say that in large part I'm successful, though I can certainly name specific areas where I fail. What matters is that Carmen and the other specific individuals from Home for Good I've worked with saw that and didn't try to push. I received exactly as much support as I wanted, with many offers of more, but no rebuke, nor recriminations if I declined. It struck me, to use our particular example, when needing to go to the DMV to obtain my state-issued ID to use until I could obtain my driver's license. Lily offered to go with me for moral support, and the sincerity of that offer legitimately made me pause and just look at her. I ultimately declined, but the offer itself was very welcome. That's not something I, as a member of the homeless community, get all that often, but I find it's very much just as important as the actual services organizations such as Home for Good provides. To use another example, Carmen hasn't seemed to feel the need to remind me of needing to turn in paperwork or go to appointments, with rare exception, which is another seemingly small thing that actually matters quite a bit. It's another sort of thoughtfulness and consideration that I, as a member of the homeless community, am rather unused to. Another example was when Mateo drove me to the Social Security building to get a replacement card. After a bit of mild chatter on the way over, he didn't really force me into conversation. As a rather taciturn individual by nature, I appreciated that. Nearly, if not all, of the interactions I've had with the volunteers from Home for Good have shown what I think is maybe not the point, but certainly a helpful element of volunteering at all. It's about more than just handing out things. It's about more than just passing forms around, which sometimes to us feels like we're filling a quota. It's about very humane and very human interactions, and the interactions I had spoke, well, not only to each volunteer's character, but to the organization they work for. I've had the good fortune to volunteer for vaguely similar things over the years, long before I myself became homeless, and I found that like anything else, like any other business really, the mentality and the character of the employees and volunteers on the front lines can be indicative of the overall atmosphere of the company or organization. In this case, there's a sense of sincere kindness as something of an undercurrent to the interactions. I find that the underlying kindness leads one to want to improve, and that ultimately is the best thing caseworkers have done. Through their continued help and, at least as important, support, I've been able to get insurance, which has, as stated, allowed me to see a therapist, which itself is helping me get a handle on the behaviors and modes of thought that are working against me. That, in turn, has led me to use their help in replacing my driver's license and get current registration tags, which has made my interactions with police fewer to begin with, but it's also helped them go much smoother, and with somewhat less of that mentioned undertone of caution and hesitation. Lastly, I'd like to mention that not only is the Home for Good organization well known by others in the community, but the organization in general, and its workers in particular, are thought of rather highly. Interactions I've had with police have gone notably easier when I mention that I've been working with Home for Good. And on 2 separate occasions, when asked who I've been working with specifically, mentioning Carmen and Lily has resulted in the officers nodding and smiling, and one sergeant even spoke with me for a few minutes simply about how helpful the organization is. Right now, as I write this, I have a lot to look forward to. I have the assistance of a nutritionist and dietitian, which is helping me make better plans for my physical health. I have the assistance of a therapist, which is helping me make better plans for my mental health. I'm also very close to being document ready for housing, which is closer than I ever thought I would be. As a coda of sorts, I'd like to express my gratitude both to the individuals who have helped me, Carmen, Lily, Mateo, and others, but also to Home for Good. I can't really imagine where I'd be right now without the help I've been given, but I can't imagine it would have been anywhere good. But now, I really do have a lot to look forward to.